hold on. I don't have ad block on this browser. That's okay. Let me. Okay. Let's watch this. Let's watch Keebster's video. All right, let's watch Keebster's video because I really want to go over a bunch of stuff here that he covers here that is I think this is a great video because he's really funny in the video, and Keebster is among high level players a generally well trusted source of information. He's pushed the limits in a lot of games, right? He posted a video of Genshin like 0 5 stars. He hasn't pulled since I don't know, like I don't think he's done any pulls, right? All the characters that he's gotten is from like free selectors. Hey Defi, I was gonna raid you if you were still streaming after this. I'm gonna work on your sketch tonight, your Papillo Lily. I'm gonna draw Papillo Lily Swallowtail finally. After almost a year and a half. Yeah, all of Keebster's stuff is from Standard Banner, right? But he stopped pulling. He stopped pulling at a certain patch, right? He only did Standard Banner, but he only did Standard Banner, but only until a certain patch. And so he released a video of like when he stopped like a year's worth of Primo Gems. And then he's also got a video now where he made 36 stars in the current Abyss with C0 characters. And then well, for most of us that watched him for his Honkai content, all of last year and all throughout most of Exalted, he released his budget guides, which were excellent references, but they were sort of like deceptive in a way, right? Because it's like, yes, it's a budget gear video, but he's got all this infrastructure that a lot of players don't have. So even for where I was, I had to scale down Keebster strats. Yeah. Then you have Theory Crafters. Yeah, I don't know, Shiba. Remember. Enviosity fans were mad that Keebster released his AR-35 Floor 10 F2P video 2 weeks before Enviosity. Remember, that was a thing. we were talking about it. We were like, people in Keebster's video had comments. Oh, he's copying Enviosity. No, bro. He posted this video 2 weeks before Enviosity did his video. Yeah, you told me. You told me that. Oh my god. Yeah. I don't know, man. Well, what? Seriously? Yeah. People were in Keebster's video. If you look into Keebster's old Genshin videos, because he only did F2P guides or reference runs for Genshin only early on. Back when like did he ever release one for AR-40? But he was basically clearing, 6 to 9 stars, 9 and 10 Abyss back when 9 and 10 and 11 were actually hard content. Before people 11 too, right? Yeah. And Enviosity fans were like, they were mad. They were like, who's this Keebster guy? Oh, Keebster's a Honkai player. Keebster's a Honkai player. All right, so I guess today we're doing a Keebster reaction video, but we'll go over this. I only really wanted to do this because one of the Twitter accounts that I'm mutuals with was pointing out some of the inconsistencies and errors with the video. And, they weren't wrong that, Keebster was kind of like generalizing and glossing over certain parts. But when I looked at it in retrospect, it was like, in practical application, Keebster's information also isn't wrong. He just kind of like skipped over some stuff because in Keebster's mind, and when I examined it from a high level player perspective, it was like, yeah, in the end, in practical application, the stuff that Keebster glossed over doesn't really matter. Yeah, right, Shiba. Yeah, everything looked fine. it was just kind of like when I looked at the criticisms more carefully, it was part of it was just being nitpicky about like terminology, and then the second thing was like I wanted to say semantics on a certain level, but it wasn't semantics, right? Because the whole point of this is semantics, is keywords. But again, it's just being nitpicky about fine details that, in my mind, for practical applications, don't really matter.
People always ask me,
Yeah.
how'd you do it?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I probably. Yeah, exactly. Right when they start to care. Zac Efron, young Zac Efron. Some of his movies were actually not bad. What was that one? The one where he has to go back in time, right? He goes back in time to try to save his marriage. That was a funny one. I don't even remember what the movie name was.
How'd you score the Miriam?
600 Days in Nirvana. All right, but I think this is his main account. I think he stopped playing his free-to-play account because he inherited a free-to-play account that he used for his budget run videos for a while. But I think he dropped that account because he was playing like 5 or 6 different other gacha games, right?
The
1 billion trillion damage.
billion damage. The zero.
This is funny. This is super funny. The zero top up, but it's actually High School Musical. The zero top up. Did he do that? Is this on his main account though? I don't think this is on his main account, is it? If it's on his main account, it's probably because he this is an account that he's been playing for a long time. Like if he been playing this account since the beginning or close to the beginning, then that level of investment will make up for the difference. But that, and also he's just really good at this game. 17 again. Yeah, that was the name of the movie. 17 again.
Zero top up.
I just this is actually what, 81k top up thereabouts. 81k. That's not bad.
Even with all
my expensive gear.
my expensive gear, I just can't seem to do it. Well, I always tell them, there's a method to the madness.
There's a method to the madness.
See, I discovered some secret tips. Whales hate them.
I love this intro.
Many players want to know them. And today, I'm going to share it with you. And actually, yeah, that is the topic of today's video, but it's not going to be that stupid. No, actually, it is going to be that stupid because, believe it or not, this is probably the driest topic in Honkai that no one wants to hear about. Basically, there is a lot of stuff that people misunderstand or misinterpret in this game.
True.
This video
Very true.
Everything I can. In the end, this is...
Okay, he doesn't explain everything, but that's because everything that he doesn't explain, he's already covered in previous videos, like his animation cancel video, his time fracture extension video. So a lot of the stuff that he doesn't cover, he's already covered in the past. Video sound is a bit low.
This is going to be a pretty disorganized video.
This should be better.
Use the YouTube chapter feature to navigate around if you need to. But let's go ahead and start. So damage is one of those things in Honkai where I would say the majority of players really don't know the origin of.
It's about gear and damage. Yeah, I know. Well, let me go back. Hang on.
And actually,
okay. Topics of discussion. Literal terms of Honkai, explaining what builds are appropriate for the current day, explaining burst mode, after exit, heavy, and retaliations. Well, okay, so one of the criticisms that was raised regarding this was that I don't think he actually went over the difference between heavy attack versus like heavy weapons as a weapon class. And then what is WTF is from the host multiplier. So the damage, anyways, let's just...
yeah,
Let me skip back forward. All right.
Let's go ahead and start. So damage is one of those things.
Whales hate them.
The majority of players really don't know the origin of. Does it come from here? Does it come from there? I don't know where.
It definitely doesn't come from topping up, but topping up can help you get those items.
Damage comes from, and most of the time the top players just test builds to see if they work. Most of the time the damage
and copy. He says copy in the subtitle. And yeah, a lot of high spenders, once they have the arsenal, which usually sometimes involves getting like 1 to 2 sets of whatever the latest meta support gear is. Like, once they have enough gear, they just copy what everybody else is doing and then follow a video. But then they might not necessarily be able to scale down. And that's one thing that I think Toki is proudest of me as a student learning from him, was being able to be flexible and scaling down. Okay, so he's going over the charts here, right?
Those charts that you see floating around on the internet are very inaccurate.
Okay, he makes one caption. Here, let me hide the subtitle. These are not necessarily inaccurate, but they're by design limited to literally one rotation, because they have to have a consistent measurement tool. And so it's always built around one rotation. What happens if the rotation changes? Suddenly another set or another loadout might actually be less bad. Okay.
And that is because the way that you play the Valkyrie suited to the build can vary a lot. If that's not enough, the boss that you're fighting can also change your build. Basically, when you see an out there build, sometimes it's just easier to stop asking.
Yeah, like what's going on here? Well, Elysia is actually not bad nowadays. Like, it's for charge attack characters. Elysia 2-piece is not bad.
Questions and just copy it. And to be fair, what MiHoYo's been doing in the past 2 years is simplifying all the builds. So a lot of the builds these days are just the 3 signature stigmatas. Back in my day, the builds looked a lot different.
Back in my day. Yeah, back in Keebster's day, yes. Back when your account state is not at the point where you're doing crazy stuff, yes. You need to be able to learn how to scale down. Yeah, so back in the day, we had a lot, like last year even, we still had a lot of like triple newt, double newt setups. And even nowadays, on, retiree accounts where like they retired, they came back to the game just to play casually, they can still scrape by and get like okay-ish scores by like cramming as many newts into the team as possible. Sometimes filling in
a couple pieces of gear is fine.
Yeah, this is actually not bad, right? OGRT Musician MB is fine. And the reason you want OGRT in this case is because the rotation is a little slower, so you're not actually getting enough candy. Or you might not have a candy free, because candy is limited to crafting 1 a day. So, like, if I told you to craft 3 candies, but you only crafted 2 and you needed to run a 3rd team, OGRT for your, elemental team is fine. Yeah, no, Keebster's got, like, probably a year or 2 on me in terms of Honkai. I only started playing, like, at the end of 2019, patch 3.6. 3.5, I started in 3. I started back up in 3.5. I was there when the game started, but I didn't really play the game. Not seriously until 3.5. And then you can see here, right? Margrave TB is your core component of Margrave. And then M will let you run Cosmic Duality faster. This is also very much a Copium Scuff Strat poverty build. Jingwei T's universal. Thales M is great for fire, and Lewin Hook B you probably got from the option box. It's great.
Enough, but when you start using more than that, you're basically using your own build.
So this is a true poverty build, but not a good one, right? Because Wang Zhaojun, in this case, yeah, and he'll explain later on why you would not want to run this. This is kind of just like, it's free. The build here is terrible, not just because it's free sticks. There are much better free stick alternatives. True, right? In this case, I would even run Ranger's Cross. Ranger's Cross here, probably run Rawled 3 set if you're really low budget. You know, Jing T, Yodo M, Musician B, and then craft a second Musician B. You do Candy, Musician MB on AE type of thing.
And that's where a lot of problems start happening. So we're going to explain the damage system itself, but before that, let's go over the stigmata lingo that goes around in the game. This is where people make the biggest mistakes, so it is very important for me to go over it. Okay, first off, we have basic attacks and burst mode. And basic attacks, like the name implies, are just the normal hits that you're...
Okay, so he goes over here, right? Every basic attack, including charge and combo, increases your crit damage by 8% for 2 seconds on the Michelangelo.
Valkyrie does. Do note that this does not include stuff like QTEs or your weapon skills. Now, this completely separates from burst mode. So what is a burst mode? Burst mode basically is when a Valkyrie uses their ultimate and their attacks change fundamentally because of it. Easy example is the Herstrip Sentience. Use the ultimate,
Kinda, Defi. Kinda.
Bonk. This is a burst mode. So if you're not sure if a Valkyrie has a burst mode or not, the easiest way to tell is on the Valkyrie select screen. Mihailo has added an icon for any Valkyrie that has a burst mode. Sometimes it can get a little bit confusing, especially with Valkyries like Fervent Tempo Delta and Alicia. So why is this important?
Because Fervent Tempo uses Fervent mode, as well as Twilight Paladin. And then Elysia is kind of like an enhanced ultimate, similar to Asuka, where they're in enhanced ult state, but it's not a burst mode.
So the buffs for burst mode cannot buff basic attacks, and the buff...
Okay, so the nuance here is that Michelangelo will still buff Swallowtail's non-burst attacks, and Dirac can still buff Delta's ultimate damage, but that's it. It won't? Hold on. I was always under the impression that when you're not in burst mode, it counts. Right. Oh, you mean the wording, Defi. Okay.
Buffs for basic attacks cannot buff burst mode. This is really important to note because some Valkyries have most of their damage in the burst mode, and some Valkyries obviously have no burst mode at all. So if you see any stigmata with the exact term basic attack or the exact term burst mode, do keep in mind this fact.
Yeah.
The next term that is...
Okay, I'm waiting for Defi's chat to catch up. It's just proof. Right. But my point is, you can still run Dirac M on any character if you don't have anything better that week and you don't need it on a burst mode character. You can still run it on a character to buff the ultimate. Because you're still getting a 26% TDM buff for for 9 seconds on ultimate activation. You just don't get the extra 26%. That's exactly what my point.
Is used on stigmatas is after exit. So after exit is used on a lot of free stigmata, and it's very often misinterpreted. The common misinterpretation is that you actually have to switch into...
I lived with this common misinterpretation for a long time. You guys remember a couple months ago, I ran that I ran physical versus Huodo. And at the beginning of my rotation, I would switch in Snowy Sniper. Apparently, I didn't need to do that. Actually, no, I did need to switch it in because I needed to switch in for Beethoven B. So never mind. I still had to switch in for the rotation because of Beethoven B. Never mind. But still, I lived with that misinterpretation a long time.
...to the Valkyrie to get this buff, but actually that's completely wrong. Basically, the Valkyrie just has to not be on the field for this buff to work. Now, most of the time, after exit buffs will last forever. However, there are some cases where there is a time associated with it.
Yeah, but what if you're using it on a character that doesn't buff crit or doesn't use crits? Like, what if you were using on an elemental? I've ran comps before where because I had Dirac M, but I didn't need Dirac M that week, I ran it on HF just for the dodge ult damage. Because I needed the Mei M on somewhere else, you know?
So for example, the 2-set for Fuhua Musician. So let's just say, for example, your support Valkyrie has the 2-set Musician set. So at the very beginning of combat, at 0 seconds, the support Valkyrie is off-field already. So this 10-second Musician 2-set buff has already taken place because the Valkyrie is already off-field. Now the worst thing about the Fuhua Musician set is the fact that this buff does not refresh at all. So what ends up happening is that if you want this 10-second buff to refresh, you actually have to wait 10 seconds first. Next.
Oh, what? Oh, ads. Because we're not watching on Chrome. Well, that's awkward. Well, I'll watch the ad to support Keebster, okay? We'll watch the ad to support Keebster. Okay. Just kidding, we skipped the ad. But how about them mid-rolls?
So evasion is basically when you evade an enemy's skill.
Okay, I really like this topic that he's going over. Because this one is actually very important when you're looking at
this is the core mechanic of Honkai Impact.
Evasion skill versus ultimate evasion versus any evasion, right?
So a few things happen when you get an ultimate evasion. The first thing that happens is that your entire team will get 2 SP. The game will also intentionally lag for a brief amount of time just to give you some feedback. It's hard to describe, but basically it feels really nice. And of course the last thing that'll happen is most likely your evasion skill will proc off the ultimate evasion. Now we want to differ the evasion skill from the ultimate evasion because you can trigger an ultimate evasion without triggering the ultimate evasion skill. And that's because even though your evasion skill can be on cooldown, you can still evade enemy attacks. So let's take the Stigmata Zoro Top for example. This Stigmata triggers off the ultimate evasion.
This part is just really good. Like, this explanation I find very good because a lot of, again, Dirac, for instance,
which can also proc off of your evasion skill. So some Valkyries can actually trigger their evasion skill without getting an ultimate evasion. Here's my Moonbeam just evading and getting the proc from Dirac bottom. Now believe it or not, MiHoYo decided...
Okay, so this was one of the criticisms levied against Keebster, was about the retaliation. Now we know that retaliation is a Durandal specific, a Bright Knight specific evasion, or it's a hard block, and it's different from perfect defense, right? It's different from perfect defense, and I don't think it counts towards Blueberry or Delta's counterattack either.
Decided to put another wording for evasion,
unless somebody else in the chat knows that it does, in which case we'll just receive that correction.
Skill, which is the effect called Retaliation. As far as I know, the description Retaliation is only on the Dante Stigmata. Basically, Retaliation is the exact same thing as proccing your evasion.
Basically the exact same thing as proccing your evasion skill, in the sense that, okay, in Dante's Stigmata wording, it included evasion skill, right? If we look back here, ultimate evasion or retaliation, but you saw that because Night Moonbeam forcing the evasion skill, it's the same. It's the same.
Exact same thing as proccing your evasion skill. Okay, next we.
So fundamentally, it's still the same, and that's my point. Is like, yeah, you're not wrong. It's a Bright Knight specific thing, but if Night Moonbeam can activate it on evasion skill without getting an ultimate evasion, then it's fundamentally just the same. But it's worded for retaliation because it is Bright Knight's specific piece of gear. Alright.
We have the difference between time lock and time fracture. So global time fracture, I'm sure we're all familiar with. Basically, the entire stage will darken. In certain stages, this will also slow down the clock of the stage, like in Memorial Arena. And by taking advantage of this, you can get a much higher score. Now, you want to differ this from the time lock /
Okay, so one of the other criticisms was that time lock and time slow are technically two different statuses, which is kind of like a yes and no. Yes in technical terms, but no in terms of application, right? Because all we need to know here is that time slow is a localized one. So BB and MC can proc retaliate off their ults. That is very, very interesting, good to know. But how often are we going to actually run Dante M on Blueberry and MC? Moonbeam dodge isn't technically an ultimate evasion, it's just the evasion skill. Because ultimate evasion, if you get an ultimate evasion with Night Moonbeam's dodge, you get extended time fracture duration. And that's the whole point of the last block of the video, was separating evasion skill from ultimate evasion. A lot of times your evasion skill will proc on ultimate evasion, but you can still ultimate evade while your skill is on cooldown. So that's good to know. But in practical, moving back to this topic about time slow and time lock, in practical applications, what that does for us is that we know that time lock and time slow is a localized enemy being debuffed with slow. Mantle and Perfect Mantle. Is Perfect Mantle a 2-set, or is that different? Mantle is just getting hit. Perfect Mantle would be ultimate evasion. Was that?
Retaliation is only on the Dante Stigmata. Basically, retaliation is the exact same thing as proccing.
Perfect Mantle active. Okay. So here in this case, then, it really is just activating your evasion skill. So technically, if you ran Dante on... Would that mean that would work on perfect defense evasion skills as well. Morphine, would you mind testing that on DK? I want to see if it works on DK. Oh my god. Dante on SP.
Time lock and time fracture. So global
Dante
time
on
lock is
SP
the
during
role
burst.
that
Okay,
we're
so
familiar with. Basically, the entire stage will darken. In certain stages, this will also slow down the clock of the stage, like in Memorial Arena. And by taking advantage of this, you can get a much higher score. Now, you want to differ this from the time lock / time slow wording, which is the status effect of the enemy.
okay, I want to open up my client because I want to go over on my weapons because I know we used to use before we got Night Moonbeam before we got Triple S Night Moonbeam and before we got cooldown reduction stigs, we used to use Artemis Guardians a lot to trigger the CH-QTE, right? But what is the conditional on CH for her QTE? It's when enemy is slowed, right? QTE triggers when an enemy is frozen. Okay, that wording is even worse. We know that it's not just frozen. We know that the QTE triggers when the enemy is time slowed, when there's a global time fracture. What? Oh, this is VP. Oh, I'm looking at VP. My god. Okay, here we go. When enemy is affected by time lock will apply time slow, which is why even though you can argue that they're two separate effects, time slow falls within time slow will be within time lock even if time slow is not necessarily. It's a rectangle and square, right? Time lock will have time slow, but time slow will not necessarily be a time lock. But for practical application,
the status on the enemy as well, so that's why it often gets.
No, so time slow is included in time fracture. Time fracture is global. Time slow and time lock is localized. Does DB team skill trigger CHQTE? Yes. Yes. If we look at Dimension Breaker, all right. Divine Breaker. No, Dimension Breaker. Applying time lock for 4 seconds. Yes. This will work because the Artemis Guardians will work. Divine Prayers is also a time lock. Hers is also a time lock. Inflicts time lock for 4 seconds. But I think Phoenix's is worded as a time slow. Right? No, hers is also a time lock. Yeah. On the target and nearby enemies within a small AoE. Okay, yeah, and that's why the Phoenix dodge is still able to proc QTE on a lot of stuff. Ultimate Evasion gives 100 Prajna, also extends the duration of the time lock. Like in application Defi, it is, but the wording is slightly different. I think time slow is something about like attack only, but time lock is attack and movement. Carmine down is also time lock. I think time lock was an older wording. Okay, so BB alt does not trigger perfect mantle, just regular mantle. Okay, so in the end, but does DK perfect defense trigger perfect mantle?
Confused, but basically time slow is when the enemy is slowed down in their attack. Some enemies are very resistant to time slow, which means the effects will either run out very quickly or just not affect the enemy at all. So you want to keep this in mind because most Valkyrie skills refer to time slow, not the time fracture. On contrast, we have the Dark Jijanyan Stigmata, which refers to the time fracture, not the
DK triggers. Okay, yeah. So perfect man. So yeah. So then the retaliation is just the evasion skill. Because perfect defense is considered the evasion skill for DK, even though it's technically a block plus counter. Right. Time lock is a localized time fracture only on the enemy, but not global. Time lock is the localized time effect, but time fracture is a global effect. But the whole point is that like it's an older wording. It's an older wording that like on all your localized Valkyrie descriptors that say that. I don't remember who actually modern day will still apply time slow, right? Because they'll either do a full time fracture, time fracture, yeah. Who else has a time lock effect? Triggers time fracture. Because the only ones that I can think of is like Phoenix, DP, and Dimension Breaker. Right. Those are all time locks, but who actually has time slow? SK ult is actually like attack slow. SK's doesn't count as like SK's doesn't count as a time slow because enemies are slowed for Eclipse inflicts time lock for 4 seconds. Okay, so this is a time lock. But SK also has an actual attack slow in addition to the time lock. Enemies are stunned and bled. Is it under passive? Is Hots Evade a time lock? No, Hots Evade is like a full time fracture once you counterattack. Chaos. What was it in SK's kit that actually applied like a hard attack slow? What about HOV? HOV is a time lock bubble. That is also a bubble, right? Local time slow, which is a bigger AoE than a time lock. Okay, so this one counts as a time slow, but the effect is still the same. HOV is actually not time lock. It's actually time slow. But it's a bigger AoE. So, time slow, as I understand it now, is like, time slow is the final effect. But time lock is the applying effect that inflicts time slow. In the same way that time fracture also applies time slow. That's the word. When local time slow ends, trigger time fracture for 1 second. I think suspended space is probably the best differentiation between a local effect and a global effect. Yeah. But for practical applications, time lock and time slow are fundamentally the same, right? So time slow is a condition whether you do it by time fracture or time lock. Time lock is single target, and then time fracture is global. You're confused? Time lock is single target, time fracture is global, including the clock, in most modes, outside of Abyss. Feels dank, man. That's okay. We're hashing it out so that you can be unconfused. The way Yui described it is what I'm trying to communicate, right? Time lock and time fracture are the application of the terms, the means of application, and then time slow is the resulting effect on the target.
You want to keep this in mind because most Valkyrie skills refer to time slow, not the time fracture. On contrast, we have the Dark Jijanyan stigmata, which refers to the time fracture.
This is actually one of the greatest free-to-play stuff, stigmatas too. And now you can craft it for cheap because now you don't have to farm United tokens or whatever. I think a lot of the stuff got overhauled in 5.1 and 5.2 So you could probably craft this with just Imaginons.
not the time slow effect. Alright, the last term I want to go over is the heavy description for a weapon. This is a really...
Okay. This case, Keebster is a little weird about, but in this case, I do feel like Keebster should know that heavy weapon is the weapon class for Bronya, and because Beethoven was originally supposed to be drive Cometas, of course heavy weapon makes sense. Now, the confusion part is where you have heavy weapon, but then you also have heavy attack.
Random description that MiHoYo put in. As far as I know, it's only on Beethoven top, and basically this only refers to a cannon, not a greatsword.
And we know, like, Keebster is using cannon as a shorthand for heavy weapon class, but we know that Bronya's weapons actually has 3 different types, right? Laser, missile, and then cannon, charge cannon. And different Bronya suits will prefer a different weapon class. Like, if you're playing Valkyrie Chariot, you want missiles. But if you're playing, like, Drive Cometa, then you want laser. Yeah, affixes will refer to it as cannon shorthand. But again, that goes back to your point, Defi, that, you know, MiHoYo never cleaned up their descriptors. Because in the collection, it's all referred to as heavy weapons. So, like, if we pull up the client here, right? We go to collection, weapons, heavy, launcher, heavy. Cannon was the old name. Yeah, which makes sense. And yeah, great sword. Hey, Wonder, thanks for the follow. It is kind of a derp description, especially when you consider that a lot of the heavy attack characters are Himeko, which use greatsword, but none of the twins have heavy attacks. So that's why what he's trying to identify here is that this is heavy as weapons, not heavy for heavy trauma.
Okay, that segment of the video was way longer than I thought it would be, and it makes me realize how complicated this game is.
Yeah, this game is freaking nuts for a gacha game. The rest of this video is gonna talk about the damage multipliers, and a lot of it, like, I really don't have anything else to comment on it.
Where we get into the deep stuff. How do you actually do damage? You want to use your own build in Honkai? This is where understanding
Smug
how the
Yanfei.
damage system works in Honkai can really help you. Do you need to do complex math? No, but understanding
the cut on that is perfect.
Knowledge is good enough. So basically, I'm going to try and explain the damage system in Honkai using an iceberg chart. Basically, all of these terms are thrown around in the stigmata lingo, and if you're a new player, you probably don't know a single thing about any of these multipliers. So here we go, from the top, starting with attack. So attack is literally the stat that your Valkyrie has. Like most games, if you have more attack, you're going to do more damage.
It's funny, because in the early game, you really don't need to worry about attack. Because as you get better gear, your attack will naturally go up. As you level up, your attack will naturally go up. Once you get into the ultra end game, then that number starts becoming more important again. Because now it's like, you need more attack to meet certain damage thresholds. And that might be the difference whether or not you can one phase a boss in a certain... in like one rotation, kill the boss, you know?
Well, where does that come from? Where the attack is useful is in skills. So in Honkai, your damage is completely calculated into skills. So for example, when you do a basic attack, that is a skill, and if you use an ultimate, that is also a skill.
SN has a heavy label. Okay, good.
Valkyrie. So for example, a hypothetical skill can do 100% of...
Yeah, my point, Defi, is that the reason why Keebster in that previous slide about heavy weapon, like heavy weapon versus like on the stigmata, was trying to clarify that it wasn't a great sword. Just because, like, even though SN has heavy label, majority of early game players, when they see heavy, they're gonna think like Himeko with the two-hander.
Of your attack. In that example, if your attack is 1000, then the skill would do 1000 damage. Moving on, we have type counters. We're all familiar with type counters if you've played the game at all. Type counters give you a 30% advantage or disadvantage. Basically just add 30% or minus 30% to your damage. They're separated from everything else and is calculated at the end. It's one of the most important aspects of Honkai, so get used to it. Moving on to layer 2, things get a little spicy, but it's nothing too complicated. So first things first, let's look at the crit stats. So the first thing to note is that the
This is important.
critical stats only matter for physical damage, which means elemental damage does not crit. How does crit work? Well, if your hit strikes a critical, then your damage gets a multiplier. And that multiplier is your critical damage. You ever play Genshin Impact? In Genshin Impact, you can easily see your critical rate and your critical damage on the stats screen. In Honkai Impact, you cannot see either of these stats.
This is so
wait a
good.
minute, what is this CRT stat? This is what we call a red herring.
Yeah,
It's not a
CRT is a
useful
waste.
stat, but it
CRT
used
is
in the
such a
calculation
waste.
for the critical
Oh my
rate. It
god.
contributes such a small amount, you can basically think of this stat as useless. If you want to know your critical rate and your critical damage, well then you have to do the hard math, or you just guess.
We just guess. True. I think a lot of us, we just kind of like, we throw it all together, we do some napkin math for the crit rate when we feel like it. But we just kind of like, all right, let's just put as much crit damage as we can onto our stigmata and pray for crits.
Critical damage is 100%. What does that mean? It means if you get a critical hit, you will do double the damage. You can compare this with Genshin Impact's base critical damage, which is 50%, so you'll realize that the crit rate stat is more important in this game, but most of our endgame builds have crit rate jacked to the tits. Next, let's talk
Most of the end. Basically, for those that don't know, in endgame Honkai, you go all in on crit damage, because the idea is if you can just roll for the crits, the crit damage will carry you to victory, regardless of how many times you have to reset and re-roll for the crits. I want to reread this.
your critical rate and your critical damage. Base critical damage is 100%. What does that mean? It means if you get a critical hit, you will do double the damage. You can compare this with Genshin Impact's base critical damage, which is 50%, so you'll realize that the crit rate stat is more important in this game, but most of our endgame builds have crit rate jacked to the tits. Next, let's talk about the damage multipliers. So most of the gear that you've seen probably buff
18 hours of crit mauled on Jizo. Yeah, that's why certain people will choose, or certain players will choose to not run those types of strats on Jizo, and they'll just look for an easier way. Now you understand what crit maulding is. Good, man. See, we're learning. Learning is taking place. Learning is taking place. This is good. This is good.
Damage in some way. For example, this piece of gear can give me 20% physical damage.
I remember when Chiruri used to run demos for me using Ryunosuke.
If I did 1000 damage, now I'll do 1200 damage. Easy, right? And you may ask yourself, is there any difference between the damage multiplier and the crit damage multiplier? In terms of function, they actually don't have any difference other than the fact that the crits are random. Going back to Genshin Impact, do you know why crit rate is so important in that game? I'll give you 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes is too long. Basically, you have a...
You're not a clown, you're the entire circus. Yeah, crits can go from 40k damage to 200k damage. Yes. I think the greatest example is when I'm playing Asuka. The damage difference between an ult finisher that does not crit versus a finisher that crits is like 1/10 or 1/16 of a third of the life bar versus like 2.5 whole thirds of a life bar. Yeah, exactly.
problem that's called dilution. So let's say you already have a physical damage multiplier in your kit. Let's say you have 100% physical damage stacked up in your kit. You're basically doing double the physical damage here. So instead of doing 1000 damage, you're doing 2000 damage. But now let's say you get another source of physical damage multiplier. Let's say it's 100% as well. So what happens from here? Do you go from 2000 to 4000 damage? The answer is, you go from 2000 to 3000 damage, and that is because the physical damage multipliers will add. You basically have a 200% physical damage multiplier. This is what we call damage bonuses stacking additively. But wait a minute, what?
I really like this next segment, and I'm getting ahead a little bit, but Keebster's about to break down the different sources of multipliers, and like, he's gonna group them, and you'll see it here, but I think that was always one thing that like I probably didn't fully understand, but seeing the video kind of made it visually more easily understood. Like which things are multiplicative and which things are additive stacking.
What about crit damage? Well, the crit damage is treated separately from the physical damage percent, so they will multiply with each other, and that basically means you go from 2,000 to 4,000 damage. It is important to note that the crit damage also stacks additively with itself though, so again, if you stack another 100% crit damage, you're going to do 3 times the damage, not 4 times the damage. And that is really important when we talk about the next thing, which is the total damage multiplier. So certain gears in Honkai have this description which describes boosting your total damage by a certain amount. Now obviously this is a damage multiplier that is indiscriminate between elemental and physical damage. However, if you keep in mind the dilution discussion that we had earlier, you might think, oh, let's add this to the physical damage multiplier that we had before. And I'm going to stop you right there because that's not how it works. That's right.
Stop you right there. TDM is another multiplier.
So that's right, if you have 100% of both, you are doing 4 times the damage. And yes, total damage multiplier will stack with itself, which means you can basically treat the 3 things that we've been talking about as 3 separate pools. Each pool will add with itself, but multiply with the others.
Very important to remember. And also, total damage will apply to weapons. That was always one of the things that I remember other players harping was like, you wanted to run HT lead to buff the weapon damage instead of Phoenix lead, where Phoenix is like combos, ult, and everything else. Does this game have diminishing returns? Yeah, so the diminishing returns is more in the form of like multiplier dilution, not diminishing returns like the more you have of it, the less it does. The only thing that gets diminishing returns, funny enough, is the crit rating, the CRT stat, because that diminishes the higher level you go. That is the most diminishing returned stat.
So if you had 100% of all 3...
And I guess if you can get to 100% crit rate, that becomes a diminishing return too.
Well,
okay, weather system is very important because...
weather system is basically one of the most important aspects of the Honkai endgame. This is basically the multiplier of the actual stage itself, and this thing can be very complicated because sometimes it works into one of these pools, but other times it can be a separate multiplier in itself, and in that case it can reduce your final damage by a ton, but on the other hand it can also increase your damage by a ton. And yes, this is basically the main way that MiHoYo balances the game. Alright, moving on to
marketing, alright? It's not just balancing the game, it's marketing. All right, ad break real quick. Gotta give Keebster his monetization, you know. All right, I gotta support the Keebster. Okay, next.
Let's start with the easier stuff. Now in Honkai Impact, it's not enough that you have to buff your Valkyrie, but there's also the fact that you have to debuff the enemy. Most of the time, the debuffs are applied by support Valkyries, and basically what happens is this is another multiplier that we have to worry about, which means yes, there are 2 other separate pools which stack additively with itself, but multiply with the others. So there's one for physical and elemental damage taken, and the total damage taken. If you've been keeping track and you had 100% of every single one of these pools, well, now you do 32 times the amount of damage. Of course, Honkai is not that simple to only have multipliers. We also have to think about the enemy's resistance. This is such an important thing to keep track of, and it can make everything we've been talking about completely useless. For example, the elemental resistance value of Jizo is about 70%, so basically just take off 70% of the damage that you were doing. Now of course, Jizo doesn't only have elemental damage resistance, he also has physical damage resistance, and that is 25%. Now most bosses have more physical damage resistance, and usually this value comes from the elite shield. The idea is you break the shield and the entire physical resistance is depleted to 0. And you may have noticed there are now shields that reduce elemental damage as well. And to make
Alright, Cake, thanks for hanging out.
It always just depends on the enemy that you're fighting. And of course, there is actually a way to get through this resistance value, and that is called Breach. So Breach directly subtracts...
Breach was so important when AE came out, aside from people who were advised to hold off on AE because they still needed to work on building their accounts, AE became very, very powerful last year. Because prior to AE, the only other character that had Breach was HOR.
From the enemy's resistance value. So Breach is extremely powerful when the resistance values are a lot higher.
I remember when AE came out, temperatures went up so fast last year. Do you remember this, Defi? Well, maybe not, because I think you started like a month or 2 after 3.7.
let's go back to our 1000 damage example. We can fight two enemies, one with 90% resistance to our damage and one with 10%. So which one is Breach going to be more helpful on? The answer is the one with 90%. Let's say we apply a 10% breach. Basically what happens is the enemy's resistance goes from 90 to 80 and
you guys
10
can't
to
see
0 respectively.
the
In the
graphics.
example with the enemy with 90% resistance, our damage would go from 100 to 200.
Well, the
So
caption
just
kind of
from
covers
10%
it.
breach, our damage already doubled. Now let's look at the enemy with 10% resistance. So our damage here would go from 900 to 1000, which is what, an 11% bonus? This makes much less of an impact, but you can see how Breach is much more important endgame. And that is because the resistance values get higher as the disturbance also goes up. Now with Breach, folks, we only have elemental Breach. And believe it or not, folks, there are 3 types of resistances, just like how we have 3 different types of buffs, which means as of right now, we have no way to build against the physical resistance and the total damage resistance that an enemy might have. But uh-oh, what is this? Physical Breach does seem to exist in the Elysian realm. This is definitely something that we might see in future patches. And do you think resistance would
Now, this is funny, and I'm glad that Keebster made this video, because I was always under the impression that the physical breach component in Elysian Realm was just impair, like permanent impair. But apparently, physical breach actually does more than impair, because impair only covers the enemy's defense stats.
simple?
And he gets into this right
and
here.
Believe it or not, there are actually different ways that the enemy gets physical resistance. So like we discussed before, an enemy might have physical resistance based on its shield, or it just has it innately. But guess what? There is another way that the boss has physical resistance, and that is the defense value that the boss has. So defense value is treated in a very complex formula. Basically,
so physical resistance, attacker's level, attacked party's defense. Oh, attacker's level, attacked party's defense. And then yeah, so basically physical breach will let us just bypass the resistance altogether. Whereas impair is like trying to lower the resistance by lowering defense.
1000 defense is like 34% resistance. The harder the content, the higher the defense. And so how does it work when a boss has 2 different sources of resistance? Do you add them? No, you do something like this. And of course, the thing that you may have heard is very important for physical teams is to use impair. Now, impair takes out a percentage of the boss's defense, which is basically just one branch of the enemy's physical resistance. But basically, for physical teams, this is the closest thing to breach that we have. When an enemy has a lot of defense, it also has a lot of physical resistance just from the defense. So when physical breach is released, you would still use it with impair. Alright, finally we get to the last layer. Alright, first off, we have independent multipliers. So these are some multipliers that are on some skills and some stigmata.
And so the independent multiplier, these independent multipliers is why people go nuts about like Stygian Nymph, or not Stygian Nymph, but like Starchasm Nyx. Why people go nuts for saying like Starchasm Nyx, you want that 3-set bonus, because the 3-set bonus gives you an independent multiplier.
Or if the stigmata says from the host, it can also say something like independent effect in parentheses. So these work completely different from all of the rest of the multipliers. If you remember, basically all of the multipliers worked in pools and they stacked additively with themselves while multiplying with the others. Well, these independent effects are not only separate from all of these pools, they also multiply with themselves. So let's read a stigmata like Thalas Mid. The second part of the stigmata gives you a 2% fire damage bonus, stacking up to 10 times, and this is a independent multiplier. So what does that mean? It means this stigmata will give you an undiluted 22% fire damage bonus. This is by far the strongest multiplier type there is, so whenever you see an independent multiplier or from the host, you're dealing with a very strong effect. Now the last thing on this is the specific multiplier. Now this is actually something that I made up.
Here you can tell like Keebster probably recorded it in 2 different sections because his voice changes.
Certain bosses and enemies will have specific multipliers. Basically, they're things that MiHoYo designed so that you can do more damage to the boss. So the easiest example is Heimdall. So each time a segment of Heimdall's shield breaks, he takes 5% more damage. And then when all 4 segments break, he takes 20% additional damage. So these are independent multipliers, so that means they multiply together. Basically, by the end, he'll take 44% more damage, and that multiplies with any of the debuffs that you might have. Now let's contrast this with Hodo. Now Hodo is a boss that takes 25% more damage when he's freezing or bleeding. And in this case, it is not an independent multiplier, it is treated as a normal debuff. And basically this debuff will add to your Newtons and stuff like that. So each boss in this game might have their own niche multipliers. Basically, it's a case-by-case basis.
It's a case-by-case basis.
Everything that has to do with multipliers. And if you made it this far, congratulations. You did it. So hopefully with this... video, you will know why the second build here is much better than the first.
Why is the second build much better than the first? Why is the second build much better than the first? Because Yodo M by herself already gives you 30% damage multiplier, which is what is covered by the 3 set of Fuhua Musician, you know? And then Teresa Gluttony will also give you TDM, because Teresa Gluttony is dropping TDM. That's why. I know I'm kind of hand-feeding you the answers, but that's why. The proc damage from Fuhua Musician T is very negligible, and then Fuhua Musician M by itself is a support stig for Fire Team, which is not what you want on a DPS. Which is why traditionally in the bottom, like, you would have something like what the bottom build is, or you would run Jing T in place of Gluttony T. Right? Jing T, Yodo M, Fuhua Musician B, that is a classic free-to-play Fire DPS set. So you feel like programs come up with this complex formula just to flex their math skills? I mean, that's kind of... I mean, if you want to know, Nightwolf, game design is all about incorporating math in creative ways. Glenny T won't give you TDM because you can't pick up candies in the air. Lamau! Musician B is flat fire damage bonus, yes, but you still have Musician B on both of these sets. Did I say Musician B? Because I meant Musician M. Musician M is your party gets 10% fire damage when you exit the field. And then T is your damage on hit will proc a fire thing.
If you have the Herstra Flame Scion, Dallas Mid is an incredibly strong Stigmata. It's free, and it's incredibly important to get if you don't have the crystals for the signature gear. Now, whether or not you understood everything that I mentioned is another question, and if you didn't, that's fine. Please try and comment a question if you do have one. I'll try and get to them when I can. But with all that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one.
So I've got my essay written.
Alright, let me watch this ad. Support the Keebster. Oops. So I got my essay ready. And I'm typing, and I forgot to save. And I lost all my work. Alright, remember to save. That's it. Remember to save your work, okay?